Hello, everyone. This is Cameron Smith from TechLogix, here again to go through another 20-minute webinar on designing pre-terminated fiber optic cables. I appreciate everybody joining today. Hopefully this is a regular occurrence for you, joining us in one of these webinars. For those folks who are watching this recorded, I appreciate the interest as well. We're going to talk today, it's a quick little bit of a talk on designing fiber optic cables, and specifically pre-terminated cables. This is actually one of the fastest growing areas for us. We do a lot of business in this area. This is where we take bulk fiber optic cable, we put the connectors on in a factory, certify it for performance, and then ship it out to the job site. Cables are built in stock lengths. We have those sitting on the shelf ready to ship, but more importantly, and most of what we're going to spend the time on today, is the custom lengths. This is where you're going out to a job site, you're taking a measurement, you're designing, on paper or on the computer, what that cable should be, how it should interact, what it's going to be plugged into, and then having that built specifically for your installation and your application. That's what this is all about today, pre-terminated cables. Now, why do we do this? What's the benefit of working with cables that are terminated in the factory? Well, the biggest advantage here is saving time in the field. We're taking something like the cable and we're just simply plugging it into the electronics, whether those are network switches, media converters, HDMI extenders. You don't need to terminate in the field. You don't need to invest in tools to put the connectors on. You don't need to invest in test hardware. These things are pre-certified from the factory. These things are prepared for installation to ensure that there's a high level of integrity as you're installing it and, integrating it. And ultimately, the entire factory installed cable, or factory created cable, I should say, is actually stronger in many instances, especially those connectors, than what you're going to be doing in the field. And that's because when a machine is putting a connector onto a bulk piece of fiber, we're using, industrial epoxies, we're using, fusion splice technology. So we're taking the boot of that connector and really molding it into the cable for performance and for strength. Now, here's the surprising thing, and here's another really big reason why people look at this, other than the tool investment or the time investment. Pre-terminated cables are often less expensive than bulk fiber plus connectors. That's surprising to a lot of people. And the reason is the connectors that we tend to work with in the field are mechanical connectors. Mechanical connectors are expensive. A mechanical connector has a lot of moving parts to it that allow you to quickly and easily terminate in the field. Machines don't worry about that. Machines use a different type of connector. Again, it's a fusion spliced connection. It's an epoxy, industrial epoxy connection. Those connectors are substantially less expensive than mechanical connectors. So when you start to look at the different lengths of fiber, when you start to look at how many connectors are going to go onto the fiber, you can actually cut down the cost of the full assembly pretty significantly when you consider pre-terminated cables. That's surprising to a lot of folks. And frankly, here at TechLogix, obviously, we build pre-terminated cables. We work with a lot of people to design these pre-terminated cables. And we see a lot of customers who come in and say, look, pre-terminate half the cable run for me, leave bare wire on the other half. I'll terminate that in the field, okay? We see things like that, and a lot of it has to do with cost. So what do we do to design this? If you're new to this process, there's a couple of things you need to take into account before you actually have this cable manufactured by the factory. The first thing is length, okay? How long is the cable run? And we'll look at a couple of slides here in a minute, but it's a good idea to not only get a pretty exact cable length, run length, but we should also look at some overage on that. Make sure you understand how long you want to be. Now, is it possible to, extend the length once it's been installed? Absolutely. You can couple a pre-terminated cable with another pre-terminated cable or bulk cable or jumpers and patches and things like that. But ideally, you don't need to do that. You get the length right during the design stage. Strand count. This is important as well. How many pieces of fiber are required? Okay. If you're doing networking, you're going to need at least 2 pieces of fiber. Most AV applications, what we're extending control or HDMI or DVI or USB, that also uses 2 pieces of fiber. And often because we're getting the cost down in the pre-terminated cable on those connectors, as I just mentioned, a lot of times people will order a 6-strand piece of fiber, have some redundant connectors there because the cost isn't going into connectors as much as it is going into the overall assembly. So strand count's also important. Fiber type, okay? There's different types of fiber that we manufacture with and that you're going to work with in the field. This is a short webinar today. We have longer webinars that, go into the different types of fiber and connectors and things like that. So if you're new to the concept of multi-mode and single mode fiber, the 2 predominant types of fiber out there, I'd encourage you to go on the TechLogic's website, watch some other videos, do a little bit of research in our article library. But the punchline here is if you're exceeding 1,000 feet in length, you're going to want to think about single mode fiber. It's designed for longer legs. Multi-mode fiber, that's great for runs that are less than 1,000 feet. And don't get me wrong, single mode can be used for short distances or long distances. But once we hit that magical 300 meter, 1,000 foot length, and we start to exceed that, you got to go with single mode. Connector type, okay? You got to know what kind of connectors are going to go onto a pre-terminated cable, right? Because we're putting those on in the factory. So you want to get those connectors right. And what I tell everybody is, look at the electronics. What are you connecting to the cable? The devices are going to tell you what kind of connectors you want. If it's network equipment, odds are it's LC connectors. These are the little small pluggable connections that you see on network switches and most media converters. If you're doing a telecom or an ISP connection, the outdoor DMARC wiring, it's going to be a bigger connector. It's going to be an SC style connector. So it's important you get a feel for how you're using the cable and design the connectors around that. Now, let's say you get it wrong. If you put the wrong connectors on the cable, you can use adapters, you can use crossover cables. You have options to correct that, but obviously best practice is try to get those connectors right. Jacket material. The jacket material plays into this. We have to know, what are you doing with that cable? If it's going to be buried outdoor, you're going to need a water-rated jacket. If it's going into a commercial application, you may need a plenum-rated jacket. Residential construction, riser-rated jacket. Now, you can get a jacket with multiple ratings. It's very common in the fiber world. So, for example, many plenum-rated jackets can also go into residential applications, and they also have an outdoor rating. So if we're putting that cable in conduit, we're covered. Put it in conduit, run it outdoors, bring it into the building, run it through the wall. That same cable run, that pre-terminated cable run, can go into a lot of different environments. But we do also have to think about armor. If we're directly burying that fiber cable in the soil, it's not a bad practice to have armoring on it, what we would call direct burial armoring. And that direct burial armor is going to protect it if somebody hits it with a shovel or rodents are chewing on it, which is, surprising to a lot of people. It's a very common way to damage a cable, rodents getting at it. Armor helps you there. But we also see armor indoors. So if we're doing, say, a manufacturing facility, if we're running our fiber over trusses or, open joists in the ceiling, that's where armoring really is going to play a role, and it's going to protect the fiber inside that cable. So armoring is another thing you're going to want to consider. Now, there are some disadvantages of working with pre-terminated cables. This is not all rosy, so we have to take into account and we have to understand the pitfalls associated with a pre-terminated cable. So first of all, pre-terminated cables, more appropriately the connectors, these can become damaged during the pull. Okay, think about it. The factory's putting the connectors on, we're pulling this cable, you do run the risk that you're going to damage the connectors. So what do we do to mitigate that? Well, first of all, most pre-terminated cables built by a factory that specializes in this is going to give you an option for an integrated pull eye. Okay, sometimes we call that pull mesh, but ultimately what we're doing is we're wrapping the connectors we're putting a special pull eye on the end of that cable. So now we can pull it through conduit or pull it across those trusses and make sure that it is protected throughout the entire process. The surprising thing is, to a lot of people who are new to fiber, it's strong. This fiber is very, very strong, and these pull eyes have up to 100 or more pounds of pull strength. So to give you an idea, the traditional twisted pair cable without any connectors on it, just the twisted pair cable, that usually runs about 25 pounds of pull strength. So this fiber cable that's pre-terminated in the factory, wrapped with pull mesh, it's going to give you over 100 pounds of pull rating. That's very strong. But here's the other good news, because I'm not saying that connectors never get damaged. It happens. And typically when we see it get damaged in the field, it's because we're pulling the connectors through conduit or Smurf tube or some sort of corrugated piping, and it gets snagged. Maybe there's a hard, 45 or 90 degree angle. Maybe there's an obstruction in the tube, but for whatever reason, it gets snagged. And then we pull it with more than 100 pounds of force and we damage those connectors. It's still bulk fiber, okay? If you were going to pull regular old bulk fiber, you'd have to terminate it in the field. If you damage a pre-terminated cable, you just repair it in the field. You just go through the termination process. And this is why a lot of companies buy pre-terms. Even though they know how to terminate, they have all the tools. Well, one, remember, it saves money. But two, they're not really off or out that much because it's still bulk fiber that can be terminated in the field. Now, we also have to look at the fact that, as I mentioned, these cables become snagged. And when they get snagged, often it's because those pre-terms, those connectors at the end, get bulky, okay? If we're dealing with half-inch conduit, if we're dealing with 3/4 inch conduit, and usually we tell people, if you're gonna do a pre-terminated cable pull, make sure you have 3/4 inch conduit or bigger, okay? But, I mean, technically you can fit LC connectors and pull mesh through a half-inch conduit. Guys, do it. But here's what we always recommend. Again, that pull mesh, that's important. Make sure we have that on the assembly. Make sure that's specified. Frankly, when we do these assemblies, any custom cable we manufacture, we always put it on the build. You got to ask us to remove it for whatever reason you don't want it. Otherwise, it's going to be a standard option. But we'll also stagger those connectors. So when we see multi-strand orders come in, 6-strand, 12-strand, basically where the end of the cable has multiple connectors in it, we stagger those. We recommend you stagger those. That way there's not a big connector ball at the end of the cable. They're gradually staggered, so they're wrapped. It's a smaller profile. And frankly, when you're connecting that cable to the network switch or whatever it's going into, you want them staggered. It's going to look neater in the rack. So for these reasons, it's very common to stagger your connectors to cut down on that, the strain required for pulling these cables. Length measurements, okay? Again, you're going to do a pre-terminated cable. You want to get the lengths right, okay? We usually recommend that you do an overage of about 10% on the cable, okay? So let's say you're doing a run 750 feet. You're going to want to add an extra 10%, or at the very least, an extra 10 to 20 feet to your measurement to be safe. Now, you can always cut down that cable, as I mentioned. You can always re-terminate it in the field. But usually what we'll see, create a service loop. So fiber can be coiled, and the average bend radius of modern pre-terminated cables is around 1 inch. So you can bend it pretty tightly in a pretty small, compact service loop that will actually fit in a lot of fiber optic boxes, whether they're rack enclosures or demarc boxes or metal wall boxes that go in the facility. You can always tell an enclosure that's designed for fiber because it has a coiler in it. It has a way to coil up excess fiber, secure it inside the box, and create patch points. Okay, so this is something that you want to think about too. Get your lengths right, put a little bit of overage in it. And then quite finally, you got to factor in some time. It does take time for a pre-terminated cable to be built in the factory, collect the epoxy, the industrial epoxy that's used in the manufacturing process to really set up. And then it's got to be tested, certified, make sure everything, is passing the, certified performance, and then ship out. We usually say plan 3 to 5 days for these cables to be manufactured. Sometimes it's more if it's, a funky configuration, like we'll get into aerial cables that have a messenger strand, stainless steel messenger strand, gel-filled cables. You'll get into different configurations that may not be typical. But when we're talking about standard riser rated, plenum rated, direct burial, most of your armored configurations, these are all day in, day out standard configurations. Plan an extra 3 to 5 days, plus transit time for you to get that cable. Now, one thing that I did want to point out before we wrap up here. So I'm flipping over to the TechLogix website. Depending on when you view this training session, this may look a little bit different. But you're going to see at the top of the screen a products tab. You're going to see a fiber infrastructure option, and then you're going to see the ability to go in and look at the different products that are offered. Pre-made fiber optic cables is where you're going to go to see those stock lengths and all kinds of different lengths. And I mean, we're not talking little patch cables here. We do that. But you're going to see stock lengths that are armored. You're going to see stock lengths that are in longer lengths. But you can also build those fiber optic cables here. This is where the pre-terminated cable comes into play. And in here, you're going to get asked questions that we went over today. So specify your length, specify your fiber type, strand counts, pick how many strands. And sometimes these pre-terminated cables get in pretty high strand counts. We've done these up to 144 strands. But you'll walk through this process designing a cable. And what'll happen is when you click the submit button, it's going to send it over to our engineering team, which is then going to confirm the build, make sure there's nothing that, looks kind of crazy. Things like, you're trying to go more than 1,000 feet, but you're doing it with multi-mode, or maybe you're getting an outdoor rated cable, but some of the other parameters look a little bit off. We're going to take that, we're going to verify it with you, and then we're going to send it into manufacturing so we make sure you get what you want. With that, I'll take any questions that anyone might have. There's a little question bar on your GoToWebinar widget. I'll give it a minute here. You see my information on the screen. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions. We like to do these little quick 15 to 20 minute webinars. We find that it's pretty good service for guys to watch, get in, get out. If you're watching this recorded, you don't have the option for questions, feel free to email us or visit the website with the information on the screen. It looks like we've covered most of the top product questions. That's good. Nothing's coming in. I appreciate everybody's time today. Have a great rest of your day.